Alright, so I'm just posting this video to go over this document that I'm posting about the actual time jump. So the time jump write-up itself, it will come out later with all more detail to it and more of the story parts, but this is the key things that you need to know so we can get started with the story, and then the rest of it will fill in as we go along. First of all, the link should be in this video as to where to find the document if you don't already have it. It's called the 2019-2020 implementation doc. The implementation notes are for how to implement all the changes that are happening this season. Alright, so there's 2 new maps, and if you look at them, they should come up. You can pull them up now if you want. And looking at them, you can tell there's a lot of stuff that changed, like just even geographically. Like forests that are gone, new swamps. I mean, it's very different in terms of some terrain changes and things. And that has to do with battles we ran over the time jump and stuff. So notice those things. Politically, it's incredibly different. Whole new areas controlled by the army of the Starless Night. Other groups that have taken over, and I go into those in detail in the notes. I mean, I say this is my notes, but it's 9 pages long, so it's almost longer than some time jumps I've done. Just the notes for this time jump. It's a pretty big one. All right, so first of all, you should know in terms of like people that that we were trying to save, like lives of people that we're trying to save. In terms of everybody that listed, people were trying to save in the time jump, everybody survived. Embarcarius is doing okay. He's still not very completely functional, but there was a lot of points thrown his way, and he did well with the recovery, so he seems to be all right. Everybody else that was listed seems to be okay, so like that's good news. Going through the actual notes here, this is more about like the implementation of things. First, order of magic. So order of power is at 2. We were worried it was going to hit 1, so I considered a win to be at 2, really. That's pretty good, actually. In the area that's controlled by the army of the Starless Night, though, if you go in there and you're attacking them, your OP drops to 1. They seem to have OP 6, and that's very bad news, but there's nothing to do about it other than try to, oppose it in game. Mage schools have OP of 3 on their actual premises, and that goes into more about the OP of different areas if you want more info on that. So, absence of dragons, because I hinted that maybe dragons would be coming back in this season, and that didn't happen. It got close. It seemed like there was a point where dragons might be more common, and it actually does seem like there might be more dragon activity now, like at the start of the season, but actually not over the time jump at all. And they seem very hampered. I go into notes about how dragons seem to act in this season, and so and how often they'll show up, and they seem very short. They don't speak at all other than in Elder Sorcery, and usually only to cast spells. Other effects on that too. Alright, so the state of the United Free Republics. This is a big a win for players. Really, the Free Republics did really well, and sort of came out as a new leader of all of Rokron. One kind of silver lining for all of this is that it kind of forced, the Army of Starless Night kind of forced all the different countries to kind of set aside stuff they've been squabbling about and kind of get on board. The way the Wizard Trader almost did, but the Wizard Trader was not, I think, a big enough threat. It seems like the Army of the Starless Night seems like a totally new and dangerous thing, and it even pushed Dagdioth onto their heels. Like it really has changed the way people see each other, different countries, and so now there's a lot more teamwork. And so I talk a little bit about the Alliance of Council Judges, which is a group that now has some oversight over all different countries. They have not a lot of like military power, but a lot of diplomatic power, and I write about them in here too, in terms of how they operate and how to run them. But the main thing, that was a really big win. There's this new kind of more solid government now. People still use kings and queens and all that stuff. They've really fallen back on that, but this government did survive. It survived at the cost of Helm. Honored League military was completely wiped out during this period, and anybody who was in a military group like Illinois Knights, Ladies of the Night Watch, Thunder Riders, Evercats, all of them have to pull for 1d4 deaths due to how many harsh situations they were in trying to hold the nation together. So that's kind of bad, but in the end, almost all the nations are part of this new organization, or newly revived organization. Only Blackspire and the Dark Wilds are kind of holding out, and they're not really holding out. They've actually sort of gotten on board, but they have to get their people behind this, and that's harder to do. Okay, the economy at large. This is a bad hit for Rokron. The economy did crash like they thought it would at the end of the time jump, and they were worried about that. There was a lot of points put towards the economy or anything like that, and in the end it did degrade and fall apart. So what that means for you is that that you lose 50% of everything that you own. All your gold, gemstones, armor, weapons, holdings, everything, 50% of it's gone. So you should turn that into the GM the next you see him, and make sure to take it off of your notes and all that kind of stuff. It also means that you need to check if you have a banknote. So if you're using one of those banknotes, you may have lost everything on the banknote if you're keeping a banknote and not the actual physical cards. You should see the GM individually with the banknote, and then they have to do a roll to see if that particular banknote survives. So be careful with that too. So that's the economy. More on the economy is that starting gold's at half, so you start with 5 gold, not that big a deal. People usually just find stuff anyway. But the bigger thing is that towns are all at 10, and major cities are at 20. And only in the capital city you're going to find half plate mail and full plate mail and that kind of stuff. Doesn't mean they're really more rare, just means that you can't buy them readily in those places. Also training restrictions. So you can't train most classes anywhere anymore. So in a town, you're only going to be able to train the guilds to rank 1 that town can train. Never mage. Also, in major cities, all rank 1s will be available, but never mage. And only certain rank 2s in a major city will they have. All mages have to go to mage schools to train. Pinnacle, Stormwatcher Tower, Estrot, Keep, Serpentin, Crowdegros, Spireguard, Randwin, Askengrad. Those are the main places you need to go. Note that no rank 3s can be trained. If you want to train a rank 3, you have to find someone who is rank 3 and is a teacher, and they'll take you on as a trainer and that sort of thing. There's no guilds that can teach those. So that's new. Mages can be taught that way too, though. Unlike, it sort of sounds like you could only teach mage at a mage school, but in reality, if you could find a mage who was a teacher, just treat it like a prestige class, you could teach it that way. Okay, so item spirit haunt developments. So there's a point where more magic items change into item spirit haunts, and it seemed like all of them might go. But because of the action of a few characters who had some close connections and understandings with them, it was prevented, and the spirits instead seem to rally around the sides of the United Free Republic. So they're sort of more on the side of the Free Republics right now, which is really cool. It's been discovered that something's been hunting the items in their item form, and that's one of the reasons why the items have had to take on this other form, is to defend against this thing that's hunting them. They're fleeing a dangerous predator, and that's one of the reasons why they act the way they do. So some items are now gone, and they have to be turned into the GM at the next event. All magic items of a certain type now have a new game rule flaw, which I'll explain. And then item spirit haunts now actually have a new way to aid characters, which is kind of cool. So first, magical clothing, rings, amulets, all this stuff became item spirit haunts. It doesn't matter what tier it is. It doesn't matter when it was made. If it's one of those items, if it's clothing, ring, amulet, basically something you wear other than armor, it's gone and become an item spirit. Note these ones will be rare, though, because their tier is higher, so they're going to effectively be greater undead, and that actually makes them stronger. And it's the understanding of the mage schools that this is for their own protection, that they're really vulnerable. These are the most vulnerable item spirits, and so they need to become item spirit haunts for their own protection. At least that's what they're starting to understand from communicating with item spirit haunts and this predator that's hunting them. So the rest of them decided to remain because they want to help the people of this world. So the item spirits seem to, like the swords and armor and shields and all these things, seem to have stayed because they feel like they want to help and they're willing to risk themselves in some way to help people here. So that's why those ones decided to stay. So moving on, magic items that have a higher tier than their owner. will begin to transform into item spirit haunts. I say begin to because they don't immediately. They sort of start to change, and so that the character can then decide to find someone, pretty quickly to give it to who has the tier for it, and then it will stay. If they can't, though, if there's no one that has the tier to use the item, and they can't find anybody within like a day or two when it starts to change, then it's gone. So I'll let you guys decide on a case-by-case basis whether that happened or not, if you can find somebody pretty quickly to give that item to. This new flaw is true of all magic items that are made with standard enchanting of summoning a spirit. So like all items actually have this flaw now, which is that if the person that has them doesn't have the tier to wield them, then they will become an item spirit. This isn't true of items that are just like sitting in a dungeon or buried, or it's really once they start to be used. So if you pick up an item and try to use it and you don't have the tier for it, that kind of triggers it to be like, oh, all right, I guess I'm out of here. And then it'll change. So you have to be careful about what you use and identify things, first, being carefully. Now keep in mind that identify is not common anymore. Like identify is not a skill that you can just go to the, town and get something identified. There are no mages that could do that. There's no mage guild in the town. So you will have to be the one to identify the item. I mean, you'll need to use your own skills and abilities to do that, and items don't just get identified for you anymore. Lastly, the thing that's really helpful is that magic items, some people have discovered that by befriending item spirit haunts and gaining their trust over time, some people have been able to make a sort of pact with them, and this allows the spirit to become an item again. And like for a day, sometimes a little longer, and the item can be used as it once was. There's kind of a danger here that the spirits have a hard time speaking of. Like, people kind of feel like mainly the risk is that when they take their old form, they become really vulnerable to this predator. And so they don't like to stay in that form. It's dangerous. They could get stuck. And there's reasons why. You can read more about that if you want. But what's kind of cool about that is that if you can find item spirit haunts and kind of earn their trust and friendship, they can become their old forms and then they can be used. And currently that's usually for just a day or so. But hypothetically, if you made a really good connection with the item spirit, you could maybe make it last longer and keep it around. So that's kind of a cool new development. All right, so areas where divine power fails. Anywhere that's on the map that's shaded, that's kind of darker shading, that's Army of the Starless Night controlled area. Those areas are where divine effects fail. I go into detail about what counts as a divine effect and all that sort of stuff, and so that we don't have any confusion on the battlefield about how that works. And then also a few exceptions, but those exceptions are very specific and GM created, and so don't use them as a benchmark for what you think would work. Stuff doesn't work unless the GM says that it does. Sacrifice is affected. So that's the next part. So people definitely know that something's happening to the divine power, and it affects their connection to how effective sacrifices are. They're not really sure exactly what it is or how it works, but they know that when they try to make sacrifices to their gods, that something's not working quite right, and they're trying to. The effect is not as effective as it should be, and they've been using research into that. They're pretty sure this has to do with these black dragons. Called the Anganakwa, and the Anganakwa are these group of dragons that seem to create their own overlay, but it's like a negative overlay. It doesn't allow magic to be cast except their magic or their allied magic. There's a pretty good evidence now that they're connected somehow with the Shadowlands because of this group that we'll go into at the end, but the Anganakwa are these beings that are all black dragons, and they have they're usually size 8, and they seem to have an effect that's causing this weird upset with sacrifices, and people aren't really sure of what it is. But this season, very likely people are going to be figuring out what that is. All right, so the rest of this is on the Army of the Starless Night, and there's a lot here because the Army of the Starless Night is a totally new opponent, and people don't know a lot about it yet. And so I go into some details, like how they have this alternative snow native ability, because it's really snowing everywhere that shaded area is, and so they live in the snow all the time, and so people there are very familiar with snow. I say alternative snow native because it's a little different than normal snow native, where you can't run in non-snow areas. It's really just that it's harder for you to run in non-snow areas. All right, so go into some groups. There's a group called the Citizens of the Starless Night. They're the common people of the Starless Night. They're like the general people who just got taken over. I explained how to play them. There's a group called the Order of the Black Crescent, which you know about probably from other posts I've done. And I go into detail about how they're all structured now and kind of their main groups and how they function. I talk a little bit more about their behavior and kind of their credo, their philosophy, because now that over time a language has been understood, 25 years have gone by. That's a lot of time. People have learned the language that they speak, which doesn't seem to be any language similar to Roacron at all. So it's had to be a completely relearned language. But they figured out that the Order of the Black Crescent is very obsessed with controlling other groups, maintaining their power structures, keeping anyone who gets out of line in check. They have very strict feudal systems. They enforce them viciously and without warning. If you step out of line with the Order, that means death. Sometimes Morganti won. They have a lot of diplomats and courtiers, actually, and that's actually a really critical survival skill within the Order of the Black Crescent, is to be able to use those skills really well, because if you don't, you get killed. You got to know your place is the idea. So the Order of the Towering Thousand still exists, but very much waning. They seem to be really falling out of power and becoming just really a mercenary group. And I talk a little bit about how they function. There's the Order of the Bloodied Seeker, also a small faction, not as small as the Order of the Towering Thousand, though, which the Order of the Bloodied Seeker seems to be kind of an elite stealth group that is really good at gathering information, finding information from enemies, covert ops, this kind of thing. They seem really good at infiltrating. They're a little bit like the Order of the Purple Lotus, but much less assassin-y. Much less about killing people, much more about stealing information, stealing important items, stealing things that are, critical pieces of info, and then using them for just the right thing. They're very rarely encountered because you just never know where they are. So the Frost of the Starless Night is where the Mists of Shabrax used to be, and that's what we used to call it. They're like a branch of the Army of the Starless Night. And they have, I go into detail about, their different types of effects they use. They're basically all undead, the different types of undead that they use, different effects, how the mist works now, and that sort of thing. So you can read more about that if you want. There's also a group that people didn't really know about called the Order of the Empty Cowl. This group is Shadowlands, or a group that has also been taken over by the Army of the Starless Night. And they seem to be very connected with the Mists of Shabrax initially, but then kind of got co-opted into the Army of the Starless Night. They use pretty much exclusively Shadowlands troops. They sometimes accompanied by these black dragons I was talking about, and so that's why they seem to have this odd effect on trying to cast magic around them. You get these like corruption counters if you divine corruption counters if you cast spells near the dragons, which turns off your ability to use divine effects, even outside of divine zones and stuff. There's more on that if you want to know about it. Now, the Crusaders of the Agantine are listed here now because they're now part of the Army of the Starless Night as well. They seem to be either co-opted or they always were, and they were sort of like undercover group that was working for Daidioth, but really undercover, like pretending to be Daidioth allied so that they could gain some kind of influence, because now they're just flat out part of the Army of the Starless Night. They have like 100 wraiths now that they use instead of just 30, and they're on the up and up in terms of their power level. Okay, the Order of the Forgotten Faith. This is one that was like nobody really encountered much at all. Also, the part of they're what the Army of the Starless Night would think of as paladins, I guess. But they don't have divine, right? So they are much more like an odd class all their own. And they seem to be focused on bringing people into the fold of the Starless Night and, through reason, conquest, and death if they have to. And they're never affected by divine effects no matter where they travel. They also seem to be immune to anyone who uses a paladin ability that they can observe. They're usually at least rank 3. They have odd abilities that sort of feel paladin-ish, but are really, distinctly not. Very much, very different. And I go into some of them. Things like magic damage and holy damage fail in the encounter that they're in. Or healing fails in the encounter that they're in. Things like this, really big, like field-wide effects, but they don't actually have any specific abilities that they're like dishing out. It's really just the fact that they're there at all just changes the whole battle. They're usually very good fighters when it comes to their actual physical skill in terms of battle skill. Although they tend to just be humans and then very rarely undead, but they seem to be really good fighters, but not necessarily like with a ton of abilities, just really good at fighting. That's pretty much it. At the end, there's a whole huge list I added here of creatures that are now common knowledge. If you're looking through that and going like, wait, there's nothing, I know there's other monsters we ran into during the time jump, and they're not on this list. That's because they're still not common knowledge. People ran into them, but they were so rare that people still don't know all about them, or they don't see them much anymore. Like they were something that the Army of Starless Night was using and tried to make more of but couldn't, or they're just still around but really rare, and that sort of thing. So these are the ones, though, that you're more likely to see a lot of. So that's why I put a whole big list of them here. Okay, I think that's it. If you have more questions about setting information and all that stuff, you can look in when I get the time jump done. I was hoping to get it done today, but that's not going to happen. This notes took really long time to write them all down. So there's just so much to do and lots of politics and all that kind of stuff to manage. So the play locations, if you want to know a little bit about that, I can tell you that people did pick the type of areas they wanted. They didn't pick their locations. That was not something they could pick this year. So instead they picked the style they wanted to play in Wednesday League, which is connected to the Saturday character quest now. Has picked kind of a undercover, covert ops kind of a setting. So I'll be talking to them tomorrow about what that's going to look like, and I'm really excited about it. I think it's going to feel a little bit different than the ones they've done before, which I think is really cool. I'll tell more about that tomorrow, though. And then the Thursday League has picked to do sort of a town-based theme setting, and so they're going to be in one location more that they're sort of delving into and exploring in a town based with sort of a reason that they're there, that they're sort of given. So if that sounds vague, that's because I want them to discover it. I don't necessarily want everybody else to know yet. And then Adult League and Club League kind of have some ideas as sort of what they're doing, but I still need to meet with Club League to ask them for their preference before I set their final location. All right, I think that's it. And I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope to put up some more when it's time. All right, bye.